This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 20. Oliver Cromwell. We have seen in the case of Laud one of the effects of the 17th century struggle upon the Protestant side of that struggle. Laud was the type of leader of those English Protestants who tried to reconcile their departure from Catholic unity and some lurking sympathy with a memory of the Catholic past. In the same Protestant camp there was present an opposite, growing force of a much more active kind, what was soon called Puritanism. Of this force, Oliver Cromwell is the representative type. It is accident, of course, that has made him so, but for his emergence as a leader of genius during the English civil wars, not he, but almost any other one of his more energetic contemporaries on the same side might appear to us today the type of militant Protestant. But though it is an accident which made of Oliver Cromwell a symbolic figure, it is worthwhile examining his nature and fortunes in that capacity. We have seen how the character of Protestantism, as it grew, took on substance and developed a particular spirit, summed up in the name of Jean Calvin. Footnote: Jean Calvin, or Calvin, in Latin Calvinus, the bald one, was the son of the steward to the See of Noyers, north of Paris. His father was excommunicated for peculation. He was dispossessed and warmly took up the anti-Catholic cause. He is, of course, known in English as John Calvin. It is his main doctrines, his attitude towards the universe, which has given tone and color to the whole Protestant movement. And though men are affected by the Calvinistic spirit in many degrees, from those who feel it vividly and profoundly to those who only feel it vaguely and superficially, wherever the Protestant type of mind exists, it is Calvin at work. We have also seen what the special marks of Calvin's doctrine were. He had accepted from earlier men the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, the idea that good works are of themselves of no profit to salvation. But though he was not the first to maintain this, for that matter, there have been many among the theologians who had long before the Reformation come perilously near to such an affirmation. It was he who affirmed it most firmly, and with the clearest definition, and he who made it triumph. Equal in importance is Calvin's second point, summed up in the word predestination. Not only does the Creator who will be saved and who will be damned, not only does the Creator know who will be saved and who will be damned, not only must he have known it from all eternity, but also he must have willed it. Calvin admitted only one will in the universe, and by that will, not by man's own will, still less by man's own acts, was he saved or damned. The third essential in the Calvinist spirit is the doctrine of conversion. The individual knows by a personal revelation, vouchsafed to him privately at a particular moment, that he is one of God's elect, predestined to glory and beatitude, while around them are the great mass of those whom God has condemned to eternal misery. To all this add Calvin's doctrine of church government. Calvin, being a Frenchman and therefore alive with the power and desire to organize a complete system, determined to erect against the universal Catholic Church a new church, which should be the guardian of these new truths, whereof he was the prophet. The Church of Calvin's we know now today as the Presbyterian organization. It is important to remember that those who came under the influence of the Calvinist spirit, only a certain proportion, indeed a minority, adhered to its full scheme. Many, including Cromwell himself, were sharply opposed to the idea of a strictly disciplined religious organization for the protection and propagation of a new religion. They argued that since private judgment was the essence of Protestantism, each congregation must be left free to believe and affirm what it chose. But the fact that there was this internal quarrel between the complete Calvinist Protestant and the more general Calvinist spirit of those who would not accept the organization of the Calvinist Church must not blind us to the essential Calvinism of the whole characteristically Protestant movement. Cromwell himself was an excellent example of this. He actually disliked the idea of a strict Presbyterian church. He fought it not only with arguments, but with armies. His own particular group called themselves independents in order to emphasize their attitude. They would have nothing to do with what the Scotch called the Kirk. They proved this when it was attempted to impose Presbyterianism on England after the Scotch alliance which the English Revolutionary Party had formed in order to fight the king. Yet, although he thus opposed the Kirk, no one was more thoroughgoing in his Calvinist philosophy than Cromwell. No one went through a more violent personal conversion. No one was more eager to assert the indefectibility of the saints, that is, the Calvinist doctrine that those who had once felt conversion were ever after secure of salvation and could not lose grace. No one was more permeated with that spirit of prostration before the omnipotence and majesty of God than was Cromwell. No one was filled with a more violent zeal against the reprobate. No one in action was more ruthless against the enemies of the new religion. The way in which Cromwell was typical of the whole Calvinist business is nowhere better seen than in his attitude towards the old religion, which this new religion had set out to kill. That is, his attitude towards Catholicism. Catholicism was for him the very spirit of evil, to destroy which from off the face of the earth seemed to him the highest of the duties lying to his hand, in so far as he could fulfill it. He could fulfill it to a considerable degree in this one province of Europe, the British Isles, when he had achieved despotic power, and his intense fanaticism on this point appears especially in the treatment of Ireland. For the rest, and in general, Cromwell was a typical figure of what is called Puritanism. Puritanism is a particular form and degree of Protestantism which has specially flourished in England, Scotland, and Wales, but of which there were wide areas throughout the Protestant world, notably in Scandinavia and in Holland. To be a Puritan is almost exactly the same as to be what the old world used to call a Manichaean. The Puritan and the Manichae had the same attitude towards the universe. Their creeds work out to the same moral and social practice, but there is one doctrinal difference between them. For while the Manichae believes in an all evil principle which works side by side with and is equal to the principle of good in the universe, the Puritan, proceeding from Calvin and therefore only admitting one will in the universe, makes both evil and good combine in the same awful God, who permits and in a sense wills evil, and particularly the sufferings of man. There is then this difference in doctrine between the two, the old heresy which continually reappears throughout the earlier Christian centuries, and the new heresy of the 16th century. But in practice the effects of the two were just the same, and the Puritanism made of the society which it affected very much what the Albigenses made of their society in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the Bulgarian heretics made of theirs in an earlier time still. The sentiment, rather than the conviction that the material world is evil, and therefore that all sensual joy is in essence evil, lies at the root of Puritanism. Joy in the arts, delight in beauty, and the rest of it are the Puritan's object of hatred. He sees them all as rivals to the majesty of God, and obstacles which deflect the pure worship and that of majesty. It has been remarked, as a curious byproduct of Puritanism, that it threw men back onto the pursuit of wealth as their main occupation. It is from Puritanism that we derive modern industrial capitalism, the centralization of wealth in a few hands, the dispossession of the masses, and their exploitation by a small number of those who control the means of production. All that we call capitalism. But though industrial capitalism and its evils are a product of Puritanism, they are only so at second hand. The Puritan of Oliver Cromwell's day, and Oliver Cromwell himself, the typical Puritan, was greedy of wealth indeed, but not as a single occupation of the mind, nor even as the chief business of man. The ardent occupation of Cromwell and those like him was the contemplation and worship of Calvin's sanguinary God, the defense of his proclaimed worship, and the extirpation of his enemies. The accidents by which Oliver Cromwell became the typical figure of English Protestantism in its extreme or puritanical form were these. He was a cadet of one of those millionaire families who had gained their enormous wealth out of the wreck of the monasteries during the period of the Reformation. His father, of whom he was the only surviving son, was himself the only son of the enormously wealthy Sir Henry Cromwell, and Henry was the son of Richard Cromwell, nephew of Thomas Cromwell, the man who dissolved the monasteries under Henry VIII. Richard Cromwell's real name was Richard Williams. He was nephew to Thomas, because his mother had been Thomas Cromwell's sister, his mother having married a tavern keeper in Putney, near London, whose name was Williams. Richard took on this important relative's name, but both he and those who succeeded him had to use the name Williams for legal purposes, and when his great-grandson Oliver lay in state, the title Oliver Cromwell, alias Williams, was embroidered on the half-royal hangings which draped the bed. When his father died, Oliver Williams, alias Cromwell, inherited an income of what we should call today something more than £3,000 sterling a year. But though his fortune was moderate compared with many of his rank, what marked him out was the immense fortune of those to whom he belonged. The Reformation has been called a rising of the rich against the poor. This does not apply to it in the remote valleys of Switzerland and the Scandinavian fells, but it is an epigram more than half true of its progress in England, and the fact that Oliver belonged to one of those millionaire families recently founded on the loot of religious endowments is highly characteristic of the whole time. The House of Commons, to which he was returned as a young man, was composed almost entirely of rich people like himself, great landowners and their relatives, with here and there a prominent lawyer, or quite exceptionally, a prominent merchant. The English House of Commons was in those days a body one called together as a rule for brief periods. It was always summoned on the accession of a monarch, and whenever there was important and solemn law-making to be done, it was summoned to confirm the king's will, and to subscribe to what he and his council and the great lords had decided. The crown had become so poor in Cromwell's time that government could not be carried on without special voluntary grants by the owners of property, and for making these grants there was no one but the House of Commons. It took advantage of its position to attack the powers of the king, and the quarrel ultimately ended in a civil war. Of the Parliament, the Lords for the most part hesitated to rise in armed rebellion. Of their relatives and fellow landowners, the Commons, rather more than half or about half were prepared to levy a regular war against the king. But even those of the richer classes who were reluctant to attack the crown physically were nearly all at heart opposed to the old claims of the crown and government, and they nearly all wanted at heart to supplant government by a king whose duty and function it was to protect the poor against the rich, the weak against the strong. They desired to supplant him and take over the government themselves. That, in effect, is what they did. They won their war. They put the king to death, and among them was the amateur soldier who so rapidly became the best professional soldier of his time, Cromwell. He had a genius for forming and leading cavalry. No one suspected it, least of all himself, until the opportunity came which made it manifest. Cromwell was already in his 43rd year when the war broke out. He had barely entered his 45th when it was clear he would become the principal military figure. He was installed the head of the victorious army by the time that he was 48, and in his 50th year it was he who plotted for and achieved the death of King Charles. He proceeded to the conquest of Ireland, a task which he accomplished with horrible cruelty, and as a result of which he dispossessed 19/20ths of the Irish nation, confiscating their land wholesale. He intended to destroy the Catholic Church altogether in that country. He thought that he had achieved that end before he died, but there he was mistaken. The Scottish Presbyterians had fought as allies of the parliamentary rebels during the Civil War, but the Scotch people had a strong feeling in favor of the Stuart dynasty, which was itself Scotch in origin. They sent an army to save the king after he had lost the war in England, which army Cromwell defeated in the most brilliant of his campaigns. They tried to make the dead king's son take the place of his father, and this gave Cromwell the opportunity for conquering Scotland, as he had conquered Ireland. He died, the complete master, through his military machine, of the three kingdoms, and the possessor, for the moment, of the strongest military force in Europe. All that political experiment of an English military republic under a protector was ephemeral. It was bound to break down, and did so within 2 years of Cromwell's death. He died on the 3rd of September, 1658, and the dead king's son, young Charles, returned and was crowned as Charles II in the spring of 1660. Nevertheless, that for which Cromwell stood had in effect conquered. Those who retained Catholic principles and inclinations in England were still very numerous. When he died, they were still more than a quarter of the population. In Ireland, in spite of the massacre and wholesale robbery, the great Catholic mass stood firm, and there at least 7/8 of the people retained their religion in spite of the conquest. But the Civil War had completed both in Britain and in Ireland that long process of Catholic impoverishment and Protestant enrichment which had begun with the dissolution of the monasteries more than 100 years before, and had been continued with the Irish confiscations under Elizabeth, and completed with the enormous fines levied upon all those landowners in England who stood out boldly and openly proclaimed themselves Catholic. Further, the victory of those for whom Cromwell stood, and of whom he was the most conspicuous leader, was the virtual end of the monarchy, although kingship had come back, amid universal rejoicing, before young Charles had been crowned at Westminster and all the rest of it. The great landowners and the great merchants, acting through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which they formed, took over the government in England, and have retained it ever since. Further, after that episode, there could be no question of the Catholic faith returning in any strength. It might have survived in a large fraction of the people, but it could never again mold the general spirit of England. Oliver Cromwell, therefore, is not only the chief Puritan figure at the decisive moment, the 17th century, when the Protestant and Catholics separated finally and agreed to call it a drawn battle. He is also the figure who marks the turning point in the transformation of England from a Catholic to a Protestant country. The process was not completed under him. Catholicism largely survived in England till it received its death blow there in 1688. By the time of his death, the Protestant character of England as a whole was firmly fixed.